We were hesitant tonight to take our panelists away from their homemaking. But we felt that they were entitled to a ladies' night out. We have this evening with us a very distinguished guest, Mrs. Alma Lutz, one of the pioneer workers in the fight for women's rights. And the vote, yes, most important, the vote. Our panel tonight is composed of three charming ladies: Dr. Mary Bunting, Mrs. Betty Friedan, and Miss Pauli Murray. It is my understanding that they will discuss what women's role in this, the great society, should be. Under Dr. Bunting's administration, Radcliffe has undertaken a program of continuing education, whose purpose is to encourage women to resume and progress in their professional development. Mrs. Friedan has been in the forefront of encouraging feminine fulfillment through serious professional and volunteer work. We only hope that after our 3 years of eating at Harkness, she has not taken women out of the kitchen forever. Miss Pauli Murray is also in the forefront of a revolutionary movement which threatens to bring the 20th century to women in Alabama. It was no easy task getting a moderator for this program. The forum made a careful and meticulous survey of the entire faculty and could find only 2 professors who admitted that they understood women. One of them is here tonight, Professor Albert M. Sachs. The other one is home planning Ladies' Day for the spring semester. Professor Sachs was president of the Harvard Law Review and received his LLB in 1948, magna cum laude. He clerked for the late Second Circuit Court Judge Augustus N. Hand in 1948 and 49, and in the following year for Mr. Justice Frankfurter. Professor Sachs was associated with the Washington, D.C. firm of Covington and Burling from 1950 to 1952 before returning to Harvard. He was the director of the Massachusetts Administrative Procedure Study in 1953 and 54, and is currently associate reporter to the Advisory Committee for the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. Professor Sachs and Professor Hart have written that favorite of all second-year law students, The Legal Process. I give you Professor Sachs.
You'll notice that I was handled by Mr. Doctors with kid gloves. First of all, he carefully distinguishes me as being in a category separate from the panel. That's one thing. And I had thought before I heard him that my function here, or at least one of my functions, was to integrate the group. But now I see that I'm here on largely a token basis, with very little to do. One thing that I will do, I will avoid any facetious humor. That's all too easy. The second thing I will do is to see if I can help you and myself to understand what we're doing this evening. The forum presents something called Dare We Not Discriminate? And it has asked this distinguished panel that question. And when I first considered my role as moderator, I thought, what is the panel going to talk about? And I asked, who is the we? Dare we not discriminate? Of course, the we turns out to be men. I think. but it's a panel of ladies. And so I decided that perhaps what was done was simply to give a perfect example of the male blindness of it all. We means everybody who matters, namely the men. And presumably, you know who they are in all cases. Since there are no ladies, since there are no men on the panel, to answer this question, since there are no men on this panel to answer the question, I thought I would take care of the title by answering it immediately. The answer is, yes, we dare not to discriminate. Provided. And the provided is the important thing. Because I suppose that both men and women have questions to ask about this topic. They are prepared to face up to it if they get some help and some understanding. For the moment, I would only put a couple of questions. I have no doubt that in this present state of constitutional and statutory law, this problem is and will continue to be a problem of law. But I take it is also a problem of the reshaping of women's goals, and I suppose it's a problem of their developing their capacities to realize such new goals. We have a panel remarkably well equipped and very well balanced to deal with all of these questions. There is a fourth question which I think I have, which relates to my feeling that above all, not much will happen in the field of women's rights and women's place in this society until there's a really great welling up of female indignation. And all I can say is I have seen very little of that female indignation. Perhaps we will see some tonight. It's possible. I, for one, will welcome it. My remaining function, apart from that of policing any obstreperous or recalcitrant people later, is to introduce the panelists. You have received a pamphlet, I think, that tells you something about each, and therefore I will keep my introductions very short. The first speaker is Mrs. Betty Friedan, who is the author of The Feminine Mystique. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Mrs. Friedan.
I'm suffering slightly from culture shock because I have just returned a few days ago from India, where I've spent the last few weeks on a sudden assignment having to do with the selection of a woman as Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy. And this country found that the fact of her being a woman never entered into the rather bitter struggle over the selection of the successor to Shastri. There were those who opposed her nomination and those who were for it. But neither from opponent nor from advocate did the fact of her being a woman affect her desirability, availability as Prime Minister of India. Mrs. Indira Gandhi was chosen Prime Minister of India as a political person and will fail or succeed as a political person. And in India, only people like me, only the outsiders who came in from the press or television or radio in Britain or Germany or from the U.S., raise the question or seem to think it was particularly remarkable that a woman should be chosen as prime minister. And my physiological clock still not regulated back to U.S. time from Indian time, I am here at Harvard Law School on a panel that says, deliberately I suppose, dare we not discriminate against women? And of course, the implication here, true implication and quite different from the situation in India, a supposedly backward country in respect to the United States, is that we do indeed and have discriminated against women, but that this discrimination is something that is so taken for granted, such a given in our society, that it can hardly be considered morally reprehensible, and that we might timidly, or as a part of a parlor game or for a subject of humor, suggest that we stop it, but not really seriously. And in fact, when discrimination on the basis of sex was added to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act this fall, it was introduced seemingly as a joke by a Southern opponent to the Civil Rights Act and treated as a joke by Congress, and was in fact added to the Civil Rights Act only because, probably much to their own amazement, the few women members of the House suddenly didn't think it was that much of a joke. There is too much human rights feeling in America now for us to tolerate any longer discrimination against women. And I would propose, in opening this discussion, merely to throw out what I think is involved in this question of discrimination against women. Women are the majority of this country, slightly over 50%. They are and have been treated like a deprived minority, with less self-respect than other deprived minorities at this time. For women in their category as people are hardly free and equal in this country if the only world they yet freely move in is the traditional world, the traditional woman's world of home, kitchen, bedroom, children, church, and a little auxiliary chauffeuring in the suburbs. Nor are they free and equal, though they have on paper and according to law almost all the rights enjoyed by others, but do not dare to use those rights because of custom, of that congruence of prejudice, half-truths, myths, and other influences to which I gave the name feminine mystique, that tells them they would be unfeminine, somehow jeopardizing their motherhood, their ability to marry or be good wives, their feminine fulfillment, if they chose seriously to use their rights and opportunities and take a full decision-making place as people in this society. Are women truly free and equal, then, if they are forced to make a choice that no man or boy is ever forced to make? That is, somehow implicitly to choose between the desired fulfillments of marriage and family and the full development and realization of whatever potential ability is in them in some serious commitment to society. Whether they make that choice because they've been brainwashed by what I call the feminine mystique, or whether they make it because these images that bombard them from the television commercials and the magazines, and even in more sophisticated forms in the school and the popularized psychoanalytic thinking, all the different influences that impinge upon them, they think somehow that their only destiny, their only future, is to get a man, and all energies must be devoted to that end, beginning before they reach their teens, and surely desirable to marry, or at least be assured of marriage before 18 or 19, and the majority do marry now, the majority of girls before 20, though in the emerging nations, child marriage is considered as the evil as it is, preventing the development of women to full maturity. If the little girls think that their only possible future and goal is to be a wife and a mother, lifelong, full-time, and therefore get the man as quickly as possible, have the babies as quickly as possible, 3 and 4 children by the time they are 25, and then wake up too late to the simple fact of perhaps another 50, 60, 70 years to live, and no plan to live it when the youngest goes off to school. Or whether girls today make such a choice with some basis of realism, because in all the large world beyond the home, whether it is the world of science or higher education, of industry or government, the patterns are so strictly defined in terms of man's world that there are no existing institutions that make it very easy for a woman in those crucial childbearing years, which, though they may not any longer be a large proportion of women's life, still are a very important portion. No very easy way to combine motherhood responsibly with serious commitment to the kind of profession or political, artistic, or scientific vocation which would use the educated abilities of the women, for instance, who sit here tonight. And women are not really, are they, very free or equal if the only image we have of fulfillment of a woman is that young romantic image, you know, the woman with the wedding veil, or whose husband will take her, if she uses the right soap powder in the machine, will take her dancing forever and make her feel like she's forever 18, or this is forever the wedding night. And the woman must fight old age continually. Well, one might have said at one point after 40, and then one might have said after 30, but with the fashions geared as they are today, one might say that a woman has to fight old age after about 14, you know. So we have no image of mature human fulfillment for a woman. And our late President Kennedy, the tragedy of his assassination in his mid-40s, we all felt so bitterly, was that he was struck down just as he was beginning to move into his full powers, his full human powers. And this was the tragedy, that at 47, just beginning to show what he could be, he was killed. At 47, a woman feels, most American women today, as if she's just, most of them, marking time, you know, getting rid of the time somehow, tranquilizing it away, because there's nothing to look forward to, and she has no real place in society, except, in most cases, some occupational therapy, busy work, and volunteer work, which, good as it may be, is not necessary, is something that no one takes quite seriously. Yes, a third of American women work outside the home, most of them as secretaries, selling in department stores, in the menial housekeeping jobs of industry, which are soon to be replaced by automation. And no one thinks it at all wrong, really, if a girl of enormous potential ability gives up her own education after high school, in the middle of college, or after her BA, gives up a Fulbright, doesn't even take seriously enough to formulate plans for her future use of her ability in order to take a job as a secretary to put her husband through law school. For his future is the important one. Hers, she will be his wife. Discrimination against women is involved in all of these things. In the absence of pattern, in the absence of image, and in, but to much lesser degree, overt discriminations that remain, which we do not even recognize as problems to be solved. It was a joke, after all, to introduce sex into the Civil Rights Act. Discrimination against women is a joke to be treated in play to terms like, can one hire a boy to be a playgirl bunny? You know, is this what will happen if we really try to enforce this? And ha, 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 we won't try to enforce it like prohibition, you know, a law that nobody will take seriously. The enemy of women today in this country, however, is not man. At least I don't think so. I think that men are fellow victims of the denigration of women implied here, of the generations of denigration of women that is now implicit in women's own denigration of themselves. When a woman is told to make marriage all of life, in a time and a place where no man can possibly expect to make marriage all of life, that woman is by definition going to demand so much of marriage that she is going to find the man inadequate. And this will place an enormous burden on the man to make up to a woman for a whole life, when he has also to bear the burdens of the larger life beyond the home that is a complex responsibility in our society for any man and supposedly for any woman, except that she is not supposed to share it. Man is a fellow victim of the feminine mystique. Man is a fellow victim of this denigration of women, and you only need to see this by listening to the jokes of the comedians, looking at the plays on Broadway, seeing the sense of the enormous hostility between the sexes that is growing in America. We seem to have taken very seriously in recent years the idea of, 88 ways to make your marriage happier, to make your sex life happier, and every woman has read ad nauseum, can this marriage be saved? And it has spawned a whole professions of people who are trying to help her save her marriage. It's, of course, always the woman who must save the marriage, and the next step, the mental health clinic, it's the woman, the mother, that is at fault for the neuroses and problems of the child. And with all the stress on being a better wife, being a better mother, all that seems to happen is that we discover more and more children who are mentally ill, and we find marriage in a worse and worse state, and it is merely enough for any comic on television to say, "my wife," for the audience to know immediately that a laugh is called for. The wife as the hostile butt of jokes in America is a phenomenon that, for instance, people from Scandinavian countries, to say nothing from people from the Far East, find strange. Evidently, in other cultures, the wife is not automatically the butt of a joke. The assumption of this enormous hostility against the wife is not there. And in converse, the family situation comedies, where the plot is not exactly family love, but family, revenge or hate, and the main motif is that the woman, who is usually a very silly little boob, will get the better of the man who is an even sillier boob, This is the enduring theme. The enemy of women today, however, the perpetuator, in a sense, of discrimination against women is women, because the denigration involved, the denigration of woman as a person, able to face the problems of a complex time and use her abilities and opportunities with the highest kind of commitment that will speak to her in this time. What keeps her from doing this above all is dependencies, fears, inhibitions in her own mind. I do not think the overt barriers are that great, but they are there. I think that if women themselves aspired higher, took on the problems involved, that they might find surprising support from men. I think men have been brainwashed the same way women have on this subject, and furthermore that the hostilities built up in men against women by too many years of too much mother, too much wife, too much demand on marriage, can find as a scapegoat the thought of any woman at all. And I have too much of them at home, for heaven's sakes, not in the office too, and not in the Harvard Club except behind a door somewhere. But even the Harvard Club of New York is having a discussion this year on the status of women. Time marches on. And in an era of civil rights, someone suddenly realized that women are going to be the last ones standing outside the gate of our whole society, which at this point stretches much further than the narrow walls of the split-level house, the ranch house, or even the elegant, restored Victorian or colonial house. Stretches far beyond the walls of a single home, and for a woman to truncate herself, to truncate a lifespan, which if for me now comes close to 80 years, for my daughter will surely be 100 years, in which motherhood can be at most a minor portion of that life, and yet we still encourage, permit, and see nothing wrong with the daughters patterning a whole life on the basis that motherhood will define it. And yet, if we are going to address ourselves to the question, dare we not discriminate against women, we must address ourselves to the fact that if we dare end discrimination against women, which means if we dare finally take women seriously as people and intend to use their abilities seriously outside the home in every area of society in which women's human potential, human mind can be of use, in an era when automation and the machine are fast replacing our automatic routinized tasks, the muscle power and the brain power we know women share with men, if we are going to think seriously of using this and of giving women a fruitful lives and fruitful maturity for a good portion of that 100-year lifespan, we must also take them seriously as women. For it is a form of discrimination against women not only to segregate them to the home and forbid them either by overt discrimination or by practice, custom, simple prejudice, forbid them from entering the decision-making areas of society. How many women, in fact, do sit on the Supreme Court, in the Senate, in the governor's mansions, in the state legislatures, in Congress? How many women full professors at Harvard? How many women presidents of college? How many women, even today, principals of schools, even of elementary schools, which used to be considered a woman's profession, declining women in all the decision-making areas outside the home. But if we are to surmount this, it surely cannot mean that only a few exceptional women who will be willing to give up their attributes as women to enter man's world as freaks or exceptions will find an open door. There must be new patterns introduced into professions previously defined as man's world that will take into account that one difference, the childbearing nature of women, which does coincide in time with crucial training years in professions like law and medicine, or crucial early years of practice. And we cannot extrapolate into the future patterns that have happened by chance and as a result of cultural lag in the present. The pattern, for instance, that so many women of my generation followed, of, yes, having education equal to man's in college, perhaps working a few years afterwards, and then taking out 10, 15, 20 years, having children, thinking that one could live according to that lovely housewife image for the rest of one's life, and then waking up at 40 to the need to do something for the rest of one's life. But 10, 15, 20 years out of a science or of any profession, too much has happened. Too much has moved on in the field. Too much has been lost in the self-confidence of the woman to move in anywhere near equal step to her own potential, to the demands she could otherwise fulfill in the society, anywhere near equality with man. Slightly, and yet it is not impossible to devise slightly different timing patterns for women, which will permit them also to mesh the new dimension of human years, the new dimension of life in society that the new years of life give them, with their traditional dimensions of wife, mother, homemaker. One can find a few far-seeing hospitals in Boston and New York which permit women now to take their training in residency training in pediatrics or psychiatry on a slightly different timing pattern than the men do, not 24 hours a day in the hospital, because these women will be having children if they are mothers during the time of their residency. When Mrs. Bunting was in Washington, the Atomic Energy Commission started what I consider a breakthrough pattern, using women on a part-time basis for scientific work, though the civil service rules seem to prohibit this utterly. A far-seeing personnel man saw that there was nothing impossible in introducing a new pattern to use very able women on a part-time basis for a few years, and then when they were able to bring them in on a full-time basis. After all, in the Atomic Energy Commission, there's had to be innovations from the beginning. The American spirit is open to such innovations. There is an urgency to this question, dare we not discriminate, that the timidity of its wording does not imply. For I suggest that if we do not stop discriminating against women now, if we do not introduce the new patterns now and face the problems that remain to be solved now to permit women to move in society, in decision-making ways in society, in equal ranks with men, and to use their rights and opportunities, the door that's open now may well be closed. There are, I understand, perhaps 5% of the students here at Harvard Law who are women. It's not a very high percentage. There are, in the colleges, a third of the seats now occupied by girls. I would suggest that the voices and the mutterings now heard behind the scenes will get louder with the pressures for higher education on anyone who expects to take a role in the society of the future, the society of automation, doing all the senior work, that there will not be a tolerance much longer for girls to use these valuable seats if girls are not going to use the education in society. I suggest also that the kinds of attitudes that, if I speak only, speaking as I am to an educated audience, in terms of the education person, the urgencies that automation pose for the educated, the problems become even more severe if we look on a wider spectrum of society. Face as we do the tragedy of the high school dropout, for instance, setting up projects all over the country to deal with the dropout, knowing that he must be somehow motivated to train himself for a future role in society if he is a boy. But the projects for high school dropouts for a girl are minimal. For the girl will marry and have children, and that's all one needs to think about her. And yet, in that rank of society, as in any other rank, the necessity for a girl to aspire to some use of her life rather than the mere production of children, as important as the production of children may be, is necessary. With the population explosion, it really isn't very desirable any longer for educated girls, much less uneducated girls, to say, I'm going to devote my life to producing children. The 5 and 6 child family may have been fashionable in the post-war years. It may be morally reprehensible in the future. There is an urgency also in terms of, if we wish to restore a decent relationship between the sexes, if we wish, for instance, heterosexual love to survive, if we don't want to succumb to a concept of sex that finds only homosexuality a viable thing, which one could gather from certain trends in theater and literature today, one must do something to end the war between the sexes. And I suggest that this is only really going to end when women are permitted to use their energies on a larger scale instead of turning them in against themselves and on the men with whom they share the confinement after the man comes home from work. And finally, I suggest that we had better stop discriminating against women and let them grow to their full stature as people if we want to raise children who are going to be able to cope seriously with the adult problems of our society today, rather than to have a whole generations of educated women put all their energies on living through their children and making it a child-centered society, begin to educate whole generations of women to put their energies on the adult problems of society, and yes, to raise children who will also be able to grow seriously to mature adult commitments in society. I think that the only way to stop this discrimination against women is, however, to begin with women. I don't think we can expect men, out of some largesse, to conceive of patterns that really only women will be able to conceive of. I think it is necessary for women to get into City Hall to make the changes that are necessary. I think it is necessary, in effect, for women to do what the Negro has done. For the Negro had his rights on paper 100 years ago. It was only in the relatively last few years when young Negroes first and then older ones began to take themselves seriously and in self-respect decided that they would no longer travel, walk, eat, buy in shops, buy houses, send their children to school, or even go to the toilet with less than full human dignity and equality as Americans, as citizens, that society took them seriously. And then we began to have Supreme Court decisions, and then we began to have changes in law. I don't think that law will begin any of this. I think it has already begun in the minds of women and men, a consciousness that is the prelude to any new step in a revolution, and this kind of session is a part of this growing consciousness. But I think that when it does begin, as far-thinking, pace-setting lawyers, you will be able to conceive of new ways to legally outlaw a kind of discrimination that is much less simple, less easy to observe and outlaw than the discrimination against the Negro. And I think that this would be a worthy task for Americans who are in the battle for enlarged human freedoms for the coming decades.